Are you looking for a hobby that will not only give you a lifetime of joy, it can take you to your happy place and totally de-stress your life? Hi, this is Kelly from ABQ Sewing Studios in Strathroy, and today I would like to go over some of the tools that you will need to start this absolutely wonderful hobby of quilting. So some of the first things that you're going to need when you start quilting are your cutting tools, because you're going to be cutting your fabric up into patches and different size pieces all the time. So the first item is a cutting board, and that is used in conjunction with the ruler and the rotary cutter. And let me just talk a little bit about that. The board itself is a self-healing mat, so when you cut on it, it heals itself up. They generally have some markings on them to help with lining up your fabrics. But you want to use the cutting board, and I always like to get the biggest sized cutting board that will fit on my cutting surface at home. So if I have a nice big table, I want to get a bigger cutting board. The smallest size that I want to get, I want to have at least something that is big enough so I can open up my fabric and I can cut it without having to fold it into a whole bunch of smaller sections. So you want to get the biggest cutting board you have the room for. Okay, now in conjunction with that cutting board, you also need a rotary cutter and a ruler. Now the rotary cutter is a very sharp rotary blade, hence the name, and the blades are replaceable. The actual cutting blade here is replaceable, but it's extremely sharp. It's like a round razor blade. So there's some safety precautions when using the rotary cutter, but we can talk about those later. Now with the rotary cutter, you want to use rotary cutting rulers, and these are a specific ruler designed for use with the mat, with the rotary cutter. And this particular size, the 6x24 or the 6.5x24, is the size of ruler that in all my years of quilting, I still use this ruler on virtually every single quilt I make. So this is the best size of ruler to start with. And the rulers themselves have inch, quarter inch, half inch markings on them. And this is what you use to cut your fabric with. Now, once I have purchased this ruler, the next type of ruler I want to get is a square. And this 6.5 square ruler is an excellent size. And now that I'm talking about the size of the rulers a little bit, I also want to mention that as a rotary cutting board, I don't really want to get anything smaller than an 18x24. Again, for the reasons that I want to be able to open up my fabric when I'm cutting my strip. I also want the 45mm rotary cutter. That's the most common size that you can get. There's bigger and there's smaller, but this is the one that you want to go for as a beginner. Now, the products that I'm showing here today are the Olfa and the OmniGrid products, and these are the products that I had started with. Now, I do have to mention that there are other brands out there. Some of them might be cheaper, but you really get what you pay for. I have a OmniGrid rotary cutting mat that I have used for over 20 years now in my quilting. It stands up. The cutter that I have is exactly this cutter. I've also used it for 20 years. I just replace the blade when I need to. So you just want to make sure that you're buying good quality stuff and it'll last you for your whole entire quilting lifetime. Now let's talk about some of the other accessories you're going to need on your quilting journey. I would like to start with pins. We all need pins. So this pin here, this is a great all-purpose pin. It's a nice long pin and it's got a lot of strength to it. It's got a nice big head, so it's easy to pull in and out. So this is pin you can use if you're putting a denim quilt together or if you're pinning on your binding. So you're going through a lot of layers. It's a good heavy-duty pin. If you're working on something lighter weight, like maybe you're doing some applique or pinning some of your pieces together and you're wanting your points to match, this is another alternative pin. It's a smaller pin. It's got a glass head, so you can actually do a little bit of pressing with it on there. So this is a great alternative pin for finer items. Now let's talk about some scissors. It's a great idea to have a nice big pair of scissors, and you want good quality ones. For cutting various items, you might cut up some fabric, different items, so you'll need a good pair of quality big scissors. And also essential is a little pair of snip type scissors. These are great for snipping threads or snipping your little pieces apart. So a little pair of scissors is also essential to go with your big pair of scissors. Now let's very briefly talk about thread. I can actually go on about thread for a very long time, but here's the basics in a nutshell. You're going to want a good quality thread for piecing, and I do like the Mettler threads. Now, in most of my piecing, I'm going to be using neutral colors. When you're putting your pieces together, you don't necessarily have to match your color of fabric, but you want something neutral, so gray or beige. And this is a good quality 100% cotton thread, and that's what you want to get for your piecing. When it comes to the quilting, this is a variegated thread, so it's very blendable, but this is a great thread that I like to use when I'm actually doing my quilting, which is what you do once your quilt sandwiches together and you're doing the top stitching. Now, with threads, you want to do the good quality threads. There is a lot of not good quality thread out there. You want to make sure that if it's thread that you purchase from the dollar store, that you don't try to put your quilt together with that, because it's just not going to stand up. You also want to make sure that it's newer thread. So those old threads that you've inherited from grandma and they came on the wooden spools or the styrofoam spools, probably also not what you're going to want to use. Thread does have a shelf life, and it's probably way too breakable at this point. And you want to stick with 100% cotton. Now let's take a really quick minute and talk about boo-boos. Every once in a while, you're going to make a boo-boo and you're going to need a seam ripper. Again, you want to get a good quality seam ripper, and there's also different sizes of seam rippers. Some of them are really, really thick, and you probably want to stay away from those. I also like a seam ripper with a nice handle that I can grab onto. And I got to tell you, the older I get and the stiffer my hands get, the more I like a nice big handle on my seam ripper. And you want to get, again, a good quality one because it'll last you for a long time. Okay, now let's take a minute and talk about marking tools. During your quilting lifetime, you are going to be marking lines on your quilts. Sometimes you're making triangles, sometimes you're marking your stitching lines, and you want to make sure that you have a marker that is, again, good quality, and it's going to suit your purpose. And there's different types of markers. These markers here, these are friction markers, and they are excellent for marking on lighter colored fabrics, and they disappear with heat. So you mark your mark on, and when you're ready for it to be, to take it off, you just apply a heat with the iron and the mark completely disappears. So they're an excellent choice. Now, if you're marking on darker colored fabrics, I like the pen right here. It has a white lead in it, and it's just like a mechanical pencil, but with a white lead, and that is erasable. So that is also excellent for marking fabrics. Now, as you go along with your quilting experience, there are some other tools that you're going to need, like an iron, an ironing board. You're going to need a sewing machine, but that's a whole nother video that I'm going to get into, especially with the sewing machines. Now, if you're wondering roughly what this is going to cost, you can basically, at the time of this video, get everything here for about $275 Canadian. So that is basically what you're going to have to put out to get started in this hobby. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have gotten a little spark of inspiration. Thanks very much. This is Kelley from ABQ Sewing Studios in Strathroy. Happy sewing!